Thank you. Hi, thank you. What a wonderful introduction. I have so much to say in response, but I'm worried that my presentation's already too long, so I better not. But I would just say this. The reason I'm a big supporter of Wabash College is because I think this college has the kind of rhetoric program that every liberal arts college in the country ought to have. I was giving a talk at another liberal arts college in North Carolina, Davidson, the other week, about 2 weeks ago, and they're trying to create something kind of like this, but they don't have it yet. So I understand the president of Wabash has some familiarity with paying big tuition bills at Davidson, and so your daughter deserves a good rhetoric program, and so that's what I'm trying to tell them as I was at Davidson speaking to those folks. But I'm honored. Brigance keeps coming up. I was told, by the way, that I was supposed to do a serious scholarly paper, so I am going to read a scholarly paper to you, but I hope it's not. After listening to your seniors, I don't think it's going to be above anybody's head. All these guys read Foucault and so on. I'm going to take a few shots at people that do that kind of work, by the way. I apologize in advance. But my title is A Legacy of W. Norwood Brigance. But it rehashes a lot of the stuff I've been talking about all over the country, trying to promote the study of rhetoric as a mode of civic engagement and a means of addressing the civic malaise that we are suffering from in this culture. And I think we have a lot to learn from Brigance. We have any art historians in the audience? Who's the artist here? But here's a 19th century depiction of public deliberation that I ran across on the web, and I used it for our website for the Center for Democratic Deliberation. And then I was realizing in preparing for this talk, looking at one of Brigance's books, he uses it in his book, always way one step ahead of me, so I owe a lot to Brigance, and I think I hope I'll make that evident. I'm a little worried about talking to him about with people who know so much about him sitting in front of me, but I'll give it a chance. So here we go. W. Norwood Brigance taught speech at Wabash, as you all know, for 38 years. And his name, I understand, is etched on the Crawfordsville Public Library. Is that correct? Yes. And yet beyond Crawfordsville, he is remembered as much more than a speech professor at a small liberal arts college. Brigance was not only a first-rate scholar, but a tireless champion of a particular type of rhetorical scholarship, what we today call public address. In 1934, he authored one of the first scholarly books in the field, Jeremiah Sullivan Black. And from 1942 to 1944, he edited our discipline's flagship journal, the Quarterly Journal of Speech, helping to transform that journal from a collection of tips for speech teachers into a serious, reputable scholarly journal. In 1943, he edited what still stands today as one of the best multi-volume collections of historical critical studies in the field, A History and Criticism of American Public Address. And over the years, he also published a number of textbooks that still hold up today as intellectually substantive treatments of public speaking as a liberal art. In short, W. Norwood Brigance left his mark on more than just this wonderful college here on the banks of the Wabash. He left a legacy that is relevant today to all of us in rhetorical studies. Now, in the master narrative of our discipline, Brigance is remembered as a traditionalist, a champion of platform oratory who celebrated the great speakers and speeches of the past utilizing neo-Aristotelian methods. In this telling of our disciplinary history, Brigance represents a paradigm of rhetorical scholarship that was predictable, even mechanical in its approach, and a pedagogy that was inherently conservative in its emphasis on reason, decorum, negotiation, and compromise. As such, or so the critics argue, this traditional paradigm privileged the voices of powerful white males over those of women and minorities and failed to acknowledge the importance of dissent in the history of American public address. And there is definitely some truth to all of that. Yet, as Marty Medhurst has shown, Brigance actually had a much more sophisticated view of rhetoric than he is sometimes given credit for. And in his own day, he was a visionary, even a revolutionary, who articulated an ambitious agenda that we have yet to fully realize still to this day. At a time when the study of public address was but a small part of a field dominated by the dramatic arts, speech correction, and behavioralist approaches to language, Brigance imagined speech as an area of serious humanistic inquiry, a discipline that could lay claim to that, in his words, great body of rhetorical literature that defines our national identity and our civic traditions. He also envisioned the discipline as the foundation of civic education and the liberal arts more generally. So in his own day, Brigance lamented that his own field, had neglected that body of great speeches, and he urged his colleagues in speech to do what their colleagues in English had done and define and critically engage a canon of great works. In this case, his speeches rather than great literary works. He also urged his colleagues to study these great speakers and speeches utilizing primary sources and the discipline's own distinctive methods, relying not on what other biographers and essayists have said, in his words, but on the records themselves. Lamenting the popularity of pseudoscientific analyses of stylistic features that were popular in his day, he used to be really irritated by these studies that counted and quantified stylistic characteristics in speeches. He urged scholars to instead authenticate text, analyze the content and audience for great speeches, elucidate the important principles and ideas they articulated, and assess their influence on American politics and history. Borrowing from the classical rhetorical tradition, which they actually read at Wabash, but not at a lot of small liberal arts colleges, he also anticipated the situational perspective on rhetoric more famously articulated 20 years later by one of my advisors, Lloyd Bitzer. Brigance urged the discipline to treat speeches not as literary objects to be admired, but as historically situated acts of strategic persuasion. Now, as I began work on the fourth edition of my own public speaking textbook, I was reminded of why we dedicated that book in the first edition to W. Norwood Brigance. Not only did Brigance have a big influence on my own views about speech pedagogy and the role of public speaking in the liberal arts, but he wrote much of relevance to larger debates over the purposes, methods, and pedagogy of rhetorical studies. Like Brigance, I think it is crucial, not just for our field, but for the civic health of our nation, that we continue to teach rhetoric as a core discipline of the liberal arts. We also need to make the case for rhetorical studies more broadly and produce solid historical critical work focusing on the evolving canon of American public address. And there's been a lot of work in recent years kind of updating the canon to include voices that have been silenced or ignored in the past. Now, unfortunately, that view of our discipline puts me at odds with some of my colleagues. I always got to pick a fight in all of my papers, who echo Stanley Fish's view that civic education is too pedestrian, too practical to be on the agenda of serious scholars at our big research universities. Indeed, some within rhetorical studies embrace a cynical, even anti-democratic perspective that rejects the idea of civic education altogether. So what I'm going to try to do in my talk today is begin with some personal reflections on how my own training in rhetoric reflected Brigance's legacy. Like Brigance and other early figures in our discipline, I was taught to distinguish speech and rhetorical criticism from literary studies and to emphasize the close association between the study of speech and the study of politics, history, and civic life. Like Brigance, I learned that the student of rhetoric also had to be a careful student of history, and from the start I was immersed in rhetoric's ancient traditions of civic education and public scholarship. At the same time, I rebelled against what one of my teachers, Edwin Black, dubbed the neo-Aristotelianism that was characteristic of that traditional criticism. And I was part of a movement in the 1980s and 90s that dramatically broadened both the subject matter and the theoretical and methodological diversity of rhetorical studies. Today, I continue to combine a strong appreciation for rhetoric's classical origins and its traditional emphasis on the ethics of civic discourse with a recognition that technological and cultural change have dramatically transformed our rhetorical and political landscape. In short, I champion what I've liked to call, in a lot of my stuff, a neoclassical rhetoric for the digital age. And I am confident that W. Norwood Brigance, were he still alive today, would hardly approve. I hope so anyway. In the second part of my talk today, I will go beyond my own personal history and reflect on some of the continuing debates over the mission and contributions of rhetorical scholarship. I will begin by asking some simple questions. What does it mean to be a rhetorical scholar? What is it that professors of speech and rhetoric profess? I'm going to call on some professors of speech and rhetoric in here to help me answer that. What sorts of socially useful knowledge do we produce, and how does that knowledge benefit students and our fellow citizens? I then reflect on some trends in rhetorical theory and criticism that have complicated answers to this question, including the dramatic proliferation of the discipline's objects of study and a tendency toward privileging theory and ideology over pedagogical concerns. In reflecting on the mission of the discipline, I make the case for reviving the classical tradition's emphasis on the ethics of civic discourse, especially for pedagogical or teaching purposes, and I sketch the broad outlines of my neoclassical rhetoric for the digital age. And I will conclude by suggesting how such a perspective might contribute to larger conversations about civic education and the role of the humanities in higher education. So, I have a section that's I originally was going to title it The Legacy of Brigance in the Liberal Arts Tradition. This, by the way, if you're not familiar with this 12th century monastery painting, which depicts the seven liberal arts. This is the Septem Artes Liberales. And when I was at Davidson, I had in the audience some political scientists and historians, and they said, where's history in the original seven liberal arts? I said, political science and history are under rhetoric there, folks. But anyway, we got philosophy at the center. I don't know if we want to stick with that or not. But anyway, I in the wake of recent events, I have changed the title of this section to The Wisconsin Idea and the Legacy of W. Norwood Brigance in honor of Scott Walker's drafting mistake up there in Madison, which you may not know about. As a graduate student in rhetoric at the University of Wisconsin, I had the privilege of studying with some of the most celebrated figures in rhetorical studies. Lloyd Bitzer, Michael Leff, Michael C. McGee. The seniors are all shaking. You've heard of all these people, right? Ramey McCarroll, Stephen Lucas. But it was Edwin Black who got me thinking about the purposes and methods of rhetorical criticism. As the author of perhaps the most influential book in the history of the discipline, Rhetorical Criticism, A Study in Method, Black was legendary for his critique of neo-Aristotelianism, a critique that almost single-handedly set the discipline on a new course characterized by a broader view of rhetoric subject matter and a dramatic proliferation of its theoretical perspectives and methods. Black's critique of neo-Aristotelianism rested on the assumption that rhetorical criticism was an art, not a science, something that W. Norwood Brigance also emphasized. And he preached that the best criticism was driven not by some formula or method, but by the critic's own taste, discernment, and judgment. I will never forget Black's pronouncement at the first meeting of my seminar in rhetorical criticism with Ed Black. I always do an imitation. He always put his glasses way down the end of his nose like this, and he would say, in a real pompous sort of fashion, "Rhetorical criticism cannot be taught." Well, to aspiring rhetorical critics, that was very discouraging news. And 3 or 4 students dropped out of the program shortly thereafter. But what he meant by that, as I understood later, was that the best criticism was distinguished not by some cookie-cutter method, but by the critic's own insight and moral discernment. Black was fascinated by the likes of Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon, which reflected another important aspect of his view of the critical enterprise. Criticism was most valuable, he wrote, when it exposed what he called odious rhetoric, or the rhetoric of, quote, bigots, demagogues, and habitual liars. In studying such rhetoric, critics were forced to temporarily suspend their repugnance and try to see the world with the cold neutrality of a sociopath. He hated Richard Nixon. His eyes would just squint when he mentioned the name. In other words, the critic first needed to understand such rhetoric, only then could he begin to account for its appeal. Black warned against criticism that was itself too political, complaining that such criticism revealed more about its author than its object of analysis. Political judgments are certainly relevant to criticism, Black wrote, and political presuppositions are unavoidable in criticism. But politicized criticism, criticism in the service of an ideology, was to his mind, quote, too heavy-handed and closed to discovery. Finally, Black argued that good rhetorical criticism had some news to report. Good criticism is always a surprise, he wrote. We don't want to read criticism that tells us nothing we didn't already know. I have that feeling a lot when I read rhetorical criticism in our journals that, you know, what did I learn? I don't know. As a budding critic, I tried to emulate Edwin Black and my other professors at Wisconsin. Like Black, I was often drawn to odious rhetoric, and I looked for ways to shake up the conventional wisdom. As a student of the history of American public address, however, I also looked for more positive lessons to be learned from the American rhetorical tradition. Like Black, I hope to expose and discredit propagandists and demagogues, but I also was looking for inspiration in the canon of great speakers and speeches in American history. So since graduate school, my work has covered a broad terrain of critiques of presidential rhetorics and election campaigns, to studies of congressional foreign policy debates, direct mail campaigns, television news, political films, and documentaries. That's the explosion of subject matter for rhetorical criticism. It's not just speeches anymore. What defines my work then is not a particular medium, like speeches, or a subject matter like presidential rhetoric, but rather a spirit of critical intervention in the deliberative process. And we now deliberate with films and social media and all sorts of things, so I think they're fair game. As a historian of public address, much of my work is focused on the progressive era, a period when our nation faced many of the same challenges we face today: rapid technological change, economic inequality, environmental degradation, racial tensions, loss of community, and political disaffection. And as I discussed in a lot of my other works, progressive reformers did not address these simply by passing new laws or implementing government programs. Rather, they sought ways to reinvigorate public deliberation, trusting that the best solutions might arise out of the collective wisdom of the people. For many progressives, the essential challenge of the era was what John Dewey would later call the problem of the public. By that, he meant the need to educate citizens in, to quote Dewey, the methods and conditions of debate, discussion, and persuasion. This concern with deliberation was at the heart of the reform efforts of the great Wisconsin progressive Robert N. La Follette. It also inspired a variety of initiatives designed to encourage public deliberation and debate, like community forums staged by settlement houses or the Chautauqua movement, the revived Chautauqua movement. The progressive era gave birth, and I had never realized this until I really started doing serious work, to a remarkable array of institutions and programs designed to foster deliberation that we take for granted today. School newspapers, student government, the civic and charitable organizations that foster community dialogue. Debate and forensics clubs flourished in colleges and universities. The University of Wisconsin even established a Department of Debate and Public Discussion to promote off-campus public debates on the income tax, women's suffrage, and other pressing issues. And by the way, you are to be commended, of course, and I advise you a plug, I think I'm biased, for doing very much the same thing with your Wabash Democracy and Public Discourse initiative. So thumbs up for that. The University of Wisconsin also led the way in articulating a new vision of higher education rooted in the progressive spirit, the so-called Wisconsin idea. Kudos to Scott Walker again, who's trying to kill that at the University of Wisconsin. Championed by La Follette, William Jennings Bryan, and Woodrow Wilson, but not Scott Walker, the Wisconsin idea I'm sorry, I can't stand that man, I'm sorry. The Wisconsin idea envisioned great land-grant universities like the University of Wisconsin serving the public by producing useful knowledge and educating for citizenship. This meant promoting science and agriculture, of course, but it also tasked major research universities with, quote, the primary purpose of developing citizenship for a better society. Not surprisingly, some denounced the Wisconsin idea, and I'm talking about then, not now, as socialism, objecting to government and tax-funded universities engaging in what the critics called social engineering. It's all, nothing ever changes, does it? Yet the Wisconsin idea perfectly embodied the cultural ethos of the day, which emphasized the need for a moral regeneration of society. It also inspired many young people to fulfill a moral obligation of service with a, quote, almost alarming missionary zeal. In the final analysis, the Wisconsin idea was not a radical, but a profoundly conservative vision. It imagined evolutionary change, not revolutionary change, effected by the people themselves with the help of university-trained experts who might, quote, disinterestedly and intelligently mediate between competing interests. Now, I don't know how much exposure Brigance might have had to the Wisconsin idea, but as a young man growing up during the Progressive Era, one who earned his MA in history at Nebraska's land-grant university, and who took summer classes from Professors Weaver and O'Neill at Wisconsin, I suspect he knew a lot about it. Indeed, the Wisconsin idea might just as well have been labeled the Wabash idea, because in his 38 years at Wabash, he championed many of the same ideas about the importance of speech and debate and democracy, about the need for historical and civic literacy, and about the role of the public address scholar as a keeper of the civic canon and a critical watchdog in the marketplace of ideas. Indeed, the pedagogical impulses of the Wisconsin idea are, in many ways, best represented today at small liberal arts colleges like Wabash, where the lines between scholarship and teaching are not so clearly drawn, and where there is a clear expectation of public outreach and service. So how's that a plug for Wabash College? Today, we have a pressing need to reimagine how research in teaching and rhetoric and public address might help to heal our nation's civic problems. In the spirit of the Wisconsin idea, we need to reinvent the 21st century equivalents of the Chautauqua and the New England town meeting. We need to find new ways to engage citizens to teach them the, quote, necessary skills of a democratic public, how to listen, how to argue, and how to deliberate. We need to discover better ways to encourage civic engagement in our increasingly diverse political culture, addressing what Mira Levinson calls the civic empowerment gap among poor and minority youth. If you have not read Mira Levinson's No Citizen Left Behind, I would highly recommend it. And the need to deploy new technologies in ways that engage rather than alienate and pacify the citizenry. Educating citizens to be citizen critics, we need to cultivate a new appreciation for what E.J. Dionne once called serious speech, speech that engages citizens in a continuous and ongoing effort to balance worthy but competing values, to mediate conflicts, and to resolve disputes and solve problems. So in a sense, this is what Brigance had in mind when he wrote that the very survival of our democracy depends on leaders who know how to talk effectively, intelligently, and responsibly, and citizens who have the popular intelligence necessary to, quote, listen and judge. Now, just to conclude this part, in one sense, Brigance had a narrower vision of the field of rhetorical studies than we have today. He would not recognize, as part of his field, much of what is published today in the journal that he once edited, the Quarterly Journal of Speech. And what he described as a wide diversity of critical techniques in a history and criticism of American public address strikes us today as rather minor variations on the method that Ed Black denounced as neo-Aristotelianism. Yet, in terms of the bigger picture, I think he had it exactly right. If we hope to restore rhetoric's centrality to the liberal arts and humanities, we need to focus on its importance to the nation's civic health and help equip students with the communicative skills of engaged citizenship. And so, in the final section of the speech, and I'm going to throw up just one more slide here to go along with that, I'm going to talk about the relationship between rhetorical scholarship and civic education in a section that I call Rhetorical Scholarship and Pedagogy in the Crucible Moment. And the slide here is of a U.S. Department of Education report that came out, I guess, 2 years ago now, that I'm going to get to at the conclusion of this part of the talk. And I'm done with Governor Walker. Reacting to 2 surveys on public attitudes toward higher education, Stanley and Katz of the Woodrow Wilson Institute at Princeton has argued that it matters deeply what the public thinks of us. Ours is a public profession. We serve society by training its young and by creating socially necessary knowledge. Professors talk a lot about academic freedom, but with that freedom comes responsibilities, I'm still quoting Katz, to our students, to our colleges, and to our communities. Chief among those is the duty to teach, which should be the core of our mission. We also have a responsibility to reform doctoral education, which has become too narrowly specialized and fails to adequately prepare post-secondary teachers. And I think you're right. I actually met a young assistant professor at Davidson who was just a wonderful individual, and she told me how horribly disappointed her advisor at Texas A&M was when she told him that she was going to a small liberal arts college. That's crazy. But that is the reality at some of our Research One institutions. As Professor Katz concludes, our duty is to profess, and that means embracing our calling to be dedicated teachers and good citizens as well as accomplished researchers. So in some of my recent writings, I've raised an important question suggested by Katz. As professors of rhetoric, what is it that we profess? What sorts of socially useful knowledge do we produce, and what are our responsibilities to our students and fellow citizens? To my mind, my colleague David Zarefsky, who is this semester a visiting professor, a distinguished scholar at Penn State, he has suggested the best answer. As students of rhetoric, we can help our fellow citizens make sense of complex public policy issues. We can help them distinguish between what Zarefsky calls the two faces of democratic rhetoric, which I understand they read in your seminar. How nice. The benign face that represents an invitation to deliberate, and the threatening face that seeks to manipulate public opinion or engineer consent. Beyond that, Zarefsky urges us to profess what Walter Lippmann called the public philosophy, which is the philosophy that acknowledges uncertainty and controversy over difficult public issues, that recognizes and appreciates diverse points of view and subjects all those points of view to critical scrutiny. The people that do that in rhetorical studies get criticized a lot. Like Kathleen Jamison has a website that criticizes both Republican and Democratic campaign commercials, and she gets criticized by people for doing that because they think she should only criticize the conservatives or something. I don't know what they think. But anyway, how much of our scholarship actually works toward that end? I would say in our journals, not much. And I'm gonna skip a little bit of this because it probably would have angered people anyway, where I talk about one of the latest issues of QJS and how it's rare to find any studies of public address at all in QJS anymore, let alone ones that take a balanced view at controversial issues. Instead, the most obvious trends have been, in the last couple of decades, one, the embrace of a particular strain of ideological advocacy, the so-called critical rhetoric. I'm not necessarily against that. Foucault kind of bothers me a little bit, but it is rooted in kind of European social theory and postmodern philosophy. And two, a dramatic splintering of the discipline into specialized tribes of scholars deploying the jargon of critical cultural studies or even some narrow area of specialization like queer theory is real big in our journals now and those kinds of things. Again, now you can argue not only do those have scholarly merits perhaps on their own, but that they represent a kind of healthy diversity. And even Zarefsky says that today's rhetorical scholarship is not only more diverse, but also more sophisticated than the monochronomic scholarship of days gone by, when speech scholars focused narrowly on platform orators and mechanically applied the neo-Aristotelian method. Indeed, Zarefsky calls the explosion of scholarly output and the increased sophistication of that work one of the most dazzling features of the contemporary scene. At the same time, Zarefsky warns that the breadth of the field and the proliferation of new theories and methods risks spreading the discipline too thin, fragmenting its scholarly identity and narrowing its appeal to those tribes of specialized scholars. In pushing the envelope, Zarefsky writes, we risk neglecting the canonical speeches that Brigance urged us to study. That, in turn, risks marginalization of an already small discipline, a discipline that is broad but not deep in its professed expertise. I then also want to talk a little bit about translating these new theoretical and critical perspectives into classroom pedagogy. And I think that's where the real problem is. Aside from their tendencies toward jargon and theoretical obfuscation, some of the new ideological and critical rhetorics reject Brigance's vision of speech as democratic education, but not by denying the possibility of civic agency and encouraging a sort of cynical debunking. Whereas Brigance's speech courses cultivated historical and civic literacy, today's rhetorical theories focus on rhetorics of resistance and dismiss our national democratic traditions as historical myths or fictions. Seeking to unmask or demystify the discourses of power, critical rhetoricians in particular seem less interested in civic pedagogy than imagining revolutionary change, which is fine. But it is interesting to note that the feminist rhetorical theory, for example, has not really radically changed the basic public speaking textbook. Even one of our leading feminist theorists, Cindy Griffin, has a textbook, a public speaking textbook, whose table of contents do not differ really at all from any other classically grounded public speaking textbook. She says her fresh approach to public speaking rejects the argument culture of the past and instead puts emphasis on civility and accommodation, but she still has arguments on evidence and reasoning, persuasion, and all the things that you would traditionally have in a public speaking textbook. Advocates of the new critical paradigms insist that their perspectives are no more political than traditional paradigms, and they're right. But they certainly are differently political, repudiating the civic republicanism championed by Brigance and resting instead on the cynical, even anti-democratic politics of people like Foucault. Am I wrong? I had to check with my Foucault expert. I can't read Foucault myself. My eyes just glaze over and I just doze off. I don't know what happened. Like Stanley Fish, they view civic education as too pedestrian, too concerned with practical problems to warrant the attention of sophisticated theoretical thinkers. I get in trouble when I read this kind of stuff to some audiences. Are you with me still? Critical rhetoric may be no more political than the neoclassical tradition championed by Brigance, but it certainly has a different political agenda, and it lacks the classical tradition's central focus on teaching and civic pedagogy. So all this is not to say, now I have to defend myself in advance of the criticism I sometimes get on this. All this is not to say we should return to the days of neo-Aristotelianism, when we upheld reason and civility as universal ideas and taught a canon of great speeches by powerful white men. Nor is it to say that we can simply ignore the cultural and technological revolutions of the past 2 millennia. Clearly, we need to rethink some of the most basic concepts you've been taught in rhetorical theory, including classical conceptions of audience and delivery. Yet that is not to say that we must reject everything about the classical tradition, including its emphasis on civic discourse, the ethics of public speech, and educating for citizenship. So what would this neoclassical rhetoric look like for the digital age? Consistent with both Brigance's and Zarefsky's vision, we might imagine a rhetoric that educates for citizenship and upholds Lippmann's political philosophy while also taking serious account of our growing political and cultural diversity. Like Brigance, we might theorize a rhetoric that upholds reason and civility as deliberative ideals, yet also acknowledges the essential role of the agitator, even the political provocateur in American political history. And that's how the canon has been evolving, and I think that's a healthy development. If you look at our Voice of Democracy site, we have as many voices of dissent and protest as we do voices of presidents and other powerful people. Like Brigance, we can imagine a rhetoric that emphasizes the responsibilities that go along with the rights of free speech in America, including the responsibility to produce, in Brigance's famous words, I love this phrase, speeches worth listening to. He's famous for kind of insisting upon that. At the same time, we must acknowledge that many voices worth listening to have been muted or suppressed throughout American history, and we must work to empower all citizens to function as members of what Zarefsky calls a deliberating and decision-making public. A rhetoric that does all of these things is not really that hard to imagine. Indeed, it is the sort of rhetoric envisioned by the interdisciplinary movement of scholars, educational and nonprofit organizations, and civic practitioners known as the deliberative democracy movement, which is represented very well by your folks here at Wabash who go down to Kettering and meet with all those folks. That's kind of the seat of the conspiracy is over there in Dayton, Ohio, at the Kettering Foundation. Working to improve the quality of public deliberation, the deliberative democracy movement is committed to rebuilding our civic infrastructure, empowering ordinary citizens, and holding all who speak to higher standards. Now, not everybody in this movement is a rhetorician. Some are even suspicious of the term rhetoric itself, but all are committed to improving the quality of public discourse, and they view that as an educational challenge. And now these champions of civic learning and empowerment have their manifesto, and that is this report published by the Department of Education entitled A Crucible Moment. And just a few words about a crucible moment, and then I'll wrap up and take some questions or comments. The crucible moment calls for making civic learning an integral component of American education at every level, from grade school through graduate school across all fields of study. Civic education across the curriculum. The report also calls for a more comprehensive vision of what it means to educate for citizenship, one that goes beyond traditional approaches, focusing narrowly on U.S. history and the laws and institutions of government. This vision imagines our modern, culturally diverse society as an ecosystem of civic alliances, social norms, and deliberative practices, and it argues for more programs promoting historical and civic literacy, communication and critical thinking skills, and the ethical commitments of democratic citizenship. It sketches the broad outline of a new vision of civic learning that is in many ways reminiscent of the writings of W. Norwood Brigance. It is a vision of civic learning and engagement that emphasizes communicative competencies within a strong ethical framework, a framework built upon a culture of mutual respect and shared conceptions of the public good. Now, the crucible moment sketches only a broad outlines of this division, but it's an important piece of work because civic education, I've been to all these symposiums and conferences on civic education. Typically, I'm the only one in the room that's not a lawyer. That's who's written our civic education curricula. And it's all about the institutions of, how a bill becomes a law. That, you know what you taught when you're a kid about civic, the bill becomes a law stuff. They don't teach the skills. And one of the things that this does is really emphasize a crucible moment that in order to teach democracy, you've got to give students practice in engaging in it. And it's why we promote what we call a deliberative model of classroom instruction, where you don't just lecture to students about civics, you have them debate controversial issues in the classroom. And teachers love it, students love it. The only people who don't love it are some of the parents. They're, it's like, I use the analogy to Little League Baseball, the parents are always the problem when there's bad sportsmanship. So I think this report opens the door to make the case for more courses in argumentation and debate, public speaking, persuasion, and public address, and rhetorical criticism. It also, we appeal to it a lot in the grant proposals we have made to NEH and other funding agencies to create things like the Voices of Democracy. They support those kinds of initiatives on the basis of this kind of a report. But in order to make this case, we have to make our case in popular media, not just on scholarly journals, and we must show what we have to contribute to what this report calls the crucible moment. And the idea of civic education has been criticized by both leftist academics and right-wing cultural warriors. The antipathy toward civic education has in turn contributed to an erosion of support for the humanities, as it has undermined the best rationale for a well-rounded liberal education. With more and more colleges and universities embracing a workforce training model of higher education, we risk further declines in the historical and civic literacy necessary to sustain our democratic way of life. With so many Americans ill-equipped to function as citizens, we risk what David Matthews of the Kettering Foundation, I don't believe I'm quoting him because he's kind of a strange dude, but what David Matthews calls a citizenless democracy. W. Norwood Brigance showed us the way to revive both humanistic education and our deliberative traditions. He envisioned a discipline committed to educating for citizenship, and following his lead, we can bring the theory and practice of democratic deliberation to broader publics, educating our students for civic life and holding all who speak to higher standards. But first, in order to do that, we must break free of our tribal impulses and embrace civic learning and engagement as important priorities. Thank you, and I welcome any comments or questions. Anyone want to defend Twitter as a forum of public deliberation? It actually has done some positive things, right? Comments, questions, anybody? Yeah, from Foucault.
I would only comment and say that the only thing incorrect you said was that I was an expert on
I don't know if anybody's really an expert on Foucault. But it is, I think that's part of, the kind of trendy stuff in rhetorical theory and criticism is grounded largely in European social theory, which seems to me kind of an odd thing to do when you're living in this country, which has a completely different philosophical and political and cultural tradition. So I've never quite understood that, but I don't dispute the scholarly merits of a lot of that work that's being done. I just don't think it contributes to this conversation very much, and it kind of tribalizes our discipline. So, yes.
I have a question. You talked about some graduate school advisors
Mm-hmm.
mainly looking down on their advisees for taking jobs at liberal arts colleges.
Yes, I don't understand that, but
How do maybe you can provide some insight for us?
Yeah.
Especially as we're graduating from a liberal arts college.
Yeah.
How do we defend the liberal arts?
Yeah.
How do you defend the liberal arts?
well, yeah, to defend it to whom? No, actually, I do have an explanation for that, and I'll tell you exactly what the explanation is because I fought this battle at Penn State. We had a College of Liberal Arts dean that's been there since the progressive era. No, I don't know when. She's been there a long time. And she has metrics that she uses to measure the quality of our graduate programs. And when I arrived there 15 years ago, that metric included placements, and the placements were defined just in terms of our placements at Research One universities of comparable status. And so as a faculty, we are under the gun. For the resources follow those measurements of the metrics. So we are under the gun to produce a high placement rate at Research One universities, or the evaluation of the quality of our graduate program would fall. Now, I don't think you have any difficulty at all defending the fact that you have a broad liberal arts education to almost any other audience than a dean at a Research One university who uses that kind of a metric, because I think that's exactly what the recruiters, the corporate recruiters that come to Penn State, they would rather hire. I had one tell me, I'd rather hire a graduate of your liberal arts college or your honors college, which is kind of a small liberal arts college within Penn State that very much duplicates the experience you guys have here, than they would somebody who is specialized, let's say, in computer programming. And this is a computer company, because they want people that are well-rounded citizens who have critical thinking skills that can communicate effectively and so on. As one of them once said to me, we can train them we can teach them the computer skills. We can't teach them, to be good colleagues and good corporate citizens and good citizens in their community. So I don't think you have anything to apologize or worry about defending that you have a broad liberal arts education to most audiences. I'm just saying in the kind of little netherworld of college deans at Research One universities, that's what they were thinking about. Now, I said I fought that fight there at Penn State, and now the graduate placement rankings in the College of Liberal Arts at Penn State also includes a list of top liberal arts colleges, and they count those as equally positive placements with Research One institutions. So we fought that battle and we've won it. So that's good. Now the bad news is we don't do much to prepare people for teaching at. I mean, what astonishes me, I look at these classes that I visited here today. Here's somebody who went to a Research One. Here's two people that went to Penn State. They study under very specialized scholars. And here she is, you're teaching classical rhetorical theory along with, and wasn't your specialization at Penn State, but these folks are teaching a kind of broad array of classes in the field that none of these people we're sending to Research One institutions would be able to do, I don't think. And we didn't prepare you well enough to do that, did we? I don't know. I tried to. I tried to prepare my advisees for that. And I certainly never, yeah. The seniors aren't so sure about what her command. Yeah, you said after I read that Platonic dialogue, I wasn't sure she knew what she was talking about. Yeah, right. So, yeah, I think we need to do more, and I've made that argument in our department. We've tried to do things, have colloquia on what is it like. I actually started a new program with Ripon College. Maybe you folks at Wabash want to do this. We now have an internship program with Ripon, and we send one of our graduate students post-comprehensive exams. Do you know Brad Serbers? Do you know him? One of our grad students is, for the first time, is going to go out to Ripon College here, I think next week, and shadow their 2 faculty members in the communication department there, meet with the students there, tell the students there what they get out of it. The students there learn what it's like to go to a major research institution, to go to graduate school. So I don't know if you guys have been briefed much on what it is to go to graduate school. After you met one of our graduate students, you may run screaming away from graduate school. I don't know. But I think that's a wonderful program, and that's one of the things we can do, the sort of thing we can do to better prepare our graduate students to maybe take jobs at liberal arts colleges like this. Anything else? Yes, Jen?
Excuse me. You talked about critical rhetoric is almost at odds with the neoclassical approach to rhetoric.
I think so, yeah. Philosophically and practically, yeah.
Why couldn't they work in tandem if a responsible rhetoric, especially with public address or otherwise, is about a concern with power and power
Yeah,
differentials?
well, I think it could. I think it can. Yeah, yeah. I think it can. I mean, I kind of resent personally the appropriation of that term critical rhetoric to describe a particular ideological attitude toward rhetoric, where it's a kind of cynical debunking. I think I'm a critical rhetorician in the sense that I engage things critically and I debunk the abuses of power that take place in the public sphere. I think I do all those things, but I don't come at it from I think it's just the kind of ideological foundations and presuppositions that a lot of people that claim that label bring to the enterprise. And there's a kind of, just a kind of cynical debunking. And the postmodern theoretical orientation that denies civic agency, you know, that kind of thing. And it was funny because we did some mock interviews. With one of our graduate students who does that, I did a mock interview with him as they were going off to do a job interview. And I said, how do you reconcile the fact that you teach public speaking, where you presumably are telling students that their voice makes a difference, with your research agenda, which says they have no civic agency? Do you see where I'm coming from here? To me, there's some incompatibility there, you know, to say that America's deliberative traditions are a fiction and a myth, to say the individual has no civic agency. Those are kind of ideological presuppositions that a lot of those folks embrace in their research that don't translate well to teaching public speaking, right? Because is that what you tell public? You know, if you're going to teach public speaking from that attitude, you come in, you're like Ed Black in Rhetorical Criticism, you know, public speaking is a waste of time, right? Because you have no civic agency, and everything is, you know, and they're kind of economic determinists. Everything's determined by the corporate domination of free speech, all that stuff. So I just don't, you know, there's a kind of disconnect there between the pedagogy and the scholarly position, I think. But it's an ideological disconnect, and like I say, I think debunking the abuses of power and people in power, how they manipulate others through speech, is something that I critique. But I don't tell my students that they have no power to change things by speaking out. I try to encourage them to speak out, right? Anything else? Nobody wants to defend Foucault. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.